Samuel Little is a convicted serial killer who claims to have strangled and killed 93 people between 1970 and 2005. Little is described by the FBI as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Next, listen to a part of Samuel Little's confession.
This is the man the FBI calls the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Samuel Little has confessed to 93 murders between 1970 and 2005. In newly released interviews, the 79-year-old recalls vivid details about the killings. The murder scenes stretching from coast to coast, like Covington, Kentucky in 1984.
How tall do you think she was?
She was about 5'7".
How much did she weigh?
She weighed about 130.
North Little Rock, Arkansas in the early 90s.
Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her. I forget her name. Oh wait, I think it was Ruth.
New Orleans in 1982.
Tell me where you met her.
I met her in a nightclub in New Orleans. Her and her sister she had two sisters. Her and her youngest sister was having a birthday party.
Some of the details are disturbing.
That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Little remembers where he was, the car he was driving, and specifics about each victim. He draws pictures of the women he killed. Many were involved in prostitution and drugs.
Tell me about Mary Ann.
She's what you nowadays they call a transgender.
She's a black male dressed up as a female. Okay, how tall is she?
Marianne about 5'7", 5'6".
Little is in prison for the rest of his life, convicted of 3 murders in California. But the FBI hopes by releasing these unconfirmed confessions, someone will come forward with details that could close each case and write a final chapter for this serial killer responsible for more deaths than Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy combined.
Through DNA evidence, Little was convicted of those murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole in 2014. Although he maintained his innocence, he soon confessed to a barrage of strangulation murders that spanned across 19 states between 1970 and 2005, ultimately culminating in 93 claims. The FBI has confirmed Little was connected to 50 cases and is seeking help from the public to help with the cases that are pending. Little was born as Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, hailing from Reynolds, Georgia. Little claims his mother was a teenage prostitute and that she had abandoned him. Authorities believe Little's mother may have given birth to him while she was in jail. Raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, Little had a difficult time in high school and eventually dropped out. Little began committing crimes in his teen years, starting with theft. He was thrown into juvenile detention, and from then on, his crimes grew worse. Starting in the 1950s, he moved around from state to state and got arrested for fraud, driving under the influence, assault, armed robbery, and rape, among other crimes. By 1975, he had been arrested over 25 times across 11 states. In total, he served 10 years from these various offenses and escaped 2 murder convictions before his 2014 conviction. Little claims he spent his years in prison learning how to box and that he showed promise as a prize-fighting boxer, a career in which he ended up not pursuing. One of the main reasons Little's murders went undetected for so long was that many of his victims and alleged victims were on the fringes of society. sex workers, homeless, drug addicts, with many being women of color. I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that, Little told the New York Times. I stayed in the ghettos. To this day, the majority of the victims remain unidentified, and many of their deaths were attributed to natural causes, drug overdoses, or accidents. Little's method of killing started out by punching his victims out cold and then strangling them to death. With no bullet or stab wounds, it was difficult to detect foul play. The LAPD gave him the name the choke and stroke killer, since he often performed sex acts while strangling his victim. According to New York Magazine, Little believed he was commissioned by God to kill his victims to alleviate their misery. At other times, he felt he was possessed by the devil. In 2012, Little was located at a homeless shelter in Kentucky and transported to Los Angeles for an outstanding drug charge. Once in custody, Little had his DNA tested, which resulted in his connection to 3 homicides in California between 1987 and 1989. In 2014, the court found him guilty of the murders and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. After Little's conviction, the FBI enlisted his information in VICAP, which began finding strong links between his movements throughout the decades to a slew of unsolved murders across 19 states. Although Little's memory of dates and what his victims were wearing at the time of their murders are not entirely accurate, he seems to have maintained an acute memory regarding other details. He remembers where he was and what car he was driving. He draws pictures of many of the women he killed. In 2018, while Little was being held in California prison, Texas Ranger James Holland visited him in hopes of solving a 1994 murder of a prostitute named Denise Brothers in Odessa, Texas. Little ended up confessing to the murder and many more in exchange to be transferred out of LA County Prison. Learning that Little had a talent for drawing, Holland provided him with art supplies so he could illustrate his victims. Since then, Little has produced impressively accurate portraits of currently victims in hopes of solving several dozen cold cases. I live in my mind now with my babies. In my drawings, he told New York Magazine, the only thing I was ever good at was drawing and fighting. Little had a long-term relationship with a woman named Jean, who is now deceased. She supported them by shoplifting. Samuel Little died at the age of 80 in 2020.